It is decision time for the Supreme Court with a couple of weeks left in its term and 17 opinions to go. We will soon know where the court stands on Donald Trump's effort to expand presidential power, along with other consequential cases. Can he fire Lisa Cook, a member of the Independent Federal Reserve Board? Can he eliminate birthright citizenship? Will the court sign off on ending humanitarian protections for Syrian and Haitian immigrants? Limit voting by mail at the state level? Well, the next opinions are coming Tuesday and Thursday. And joining me here in the studio, we're awfully glad to welcome Leah Littman, co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast and law professor at the University of Michigan. She's also author of Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes, which came out in paperback on Tuesday. Well done, you. Thanks for being here. So many of these decisions, Leah, as you know, they will test the court on where it stands relative to Trump and his attempts to expand presidential power. What are you going to be looking out for?
I think one of the big cases is the case involving independent agencies, because in addition to trying to fire Lisa Cook, who's the governor of the Federal Reserve Board, Donald Trump has fired the heads of several multi-member commissions at the Federal Trade Commission and other agencies. These are agencies that have historically been independent, and if the court gives him the power to fire the people who head these agencies that regulate big corporations and also hand out government contracts, that's a potential recipe for him to engage in even more grift along the lines of the no-bid contract that failed to purify the waters in the reflecting pool.
Yeah. So in a recent article, you suggest not to celebrate too much if the court rules against lifting birthright citizenship. Why?
So I think the court is going to say that this executive order denying birthright citizenship to some people who were born in the United States is unconstitutional. And they'll be telling the president you can't nullify the 14th Amendment. But the unfortunate reality is they have allowed states to nullify other parts of the 14th Amendment, specifically when they allowed Alabama to move forward with maps that lower courts concluded intentionally discriminated against black voters, even before the decisions invalidating the Voting Rights Act and nullifying that statute. They said states couldn't enforce another part of the 14th Amendment against Donald Trump and disqualify him for running for office because he participated in the January 6th Stop the Steal movement. So they've already done a lot to kind of whittle down the Reconstruction amendments.
So in terms of voting, the Supreme Court is set to rule on a challenge, and this is to the Mississippi law allowing for the late counting of ballots. So how does this decision potentially impact the midterms, Leah? And would blocking late ballot counting, would that, I guess, erode trust in the system, or would it preserve trust in the system, or would it create a risk to voting rights? What would be the reaction to that?
I think it's unclear. I think if the Supreme Court says federal laws prohibit states from counting ballots received after Election Day, that would be hugely consequential, because almost half the states, slightly more than half of the states, allow absentee ballots received after Election Day to be counted. So if the court actually nullified those laws in the lead up to the midterms, when many states have already begun to kind of implement the wind up to the election, that could be hugely destabilizing. And my guess is that would undermine confidence in the system as voters are confused, state election officials are confused, and more.
Do you expect the Supreme Court to see it that way?
I don't know. Honestly, at the oral argument, it sounded like several of the Republican appointees wanted to find a way to say states couldn't count ballots received after Election Day. It's unclear if there will be 5 votes for that proposition, but my guess is at least a few of the justices will indeed vote that way.
If the courts rule against the president's attempted power grabs, do you see that as an act of judicial courage, or do you interpret it as the law as it was intended and they see it that way?
I think it probably depends a little bit what case we're talking about. You know, on the tariffs decision, for example, I think there ruling against the president was in some respects helpful to the Republican Party, given how unpopular the tariffs are and they raise costs. I also think that narrowing the president's power in that case was a way for the Republican appointees to say presidents can't unilaterally impose what are effectively taxes. So I think it probably depends what set of cases or case we're talking about if and when the court rules against the administration as to what complex of considerations might be at play.
We do know this week that the government, the court ruled that the government cannot criminally prosecute someone for possessing a firearm because he smoked marijuana, a few times. It was a unanimous decision. However, two of the three liberal judges are now questioning the conservatives' approach to deciding Second Amendment cases. So you had Ketanji Brown Jackson, who called the historical tradition test, quote, unworkable. Do you expect the court to change how it decides on rights cases?
I don't think the court is going to pull back from the history and tradition approach. This is something they have embraced in the context of abortion rights, unenumerated rights, the Second Amendment, and other areas of law. I do think that this Second Amendment decision was a particularly pointed example about how silly the approach was, given that Justice Gorsuch's majority opinion effectively said there is a rich history and tradition of Americans getting hammered, and therefore the law doesn't allow the federal government to actually disarm people just because they use unlawful controlled substances.
You know what? I'm going to end the conversation on that because that was a good one. Rarely do we get to laugh like this heartily when it comes to the legal challenges in this country. Lee Lippman, thank you so much. And again, congrats on the book having gone paperback.